you talking in the book about how political Islam has changed in response to the conditions that they face. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. So actually, when I started conducting my research, really, I guess 10 years ago, when I was living in Jordan and focusing on the Muslim Brotherhood there, like most other scholars of political Islam, I pretty much bought into this notion that more inclusion leads to more moderation. So, also known as the inclusion moderation hypothesis or the participation moderation trade off. So, there's a very big strain in the academic literature pointing to how ideological parties change or move in a particular direction as a result of being part of the democratic process. But as I continued my research, I kind of ran into a bit of a puzzle. So, what I found in looking at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan, and those were the two primary cases I was focusing on, they became more moderate over a particular period of time on a number of different indicators. So, for example, embracing at least some of the tenets of democratic life, alternation of power, popular sovereignty, at least becoming more open to the notion of citizenship, de-emphasizing the role of Sharia law in their political platforms, reaching out like never before to liberal and leftist groups. They democratized their internal organizational structures, so on and so forth. But those things happened not under a democratic opening, but actually as repression was intensifying. So in the 90s and 2000s, the Mubarak regime in Egypt and the monarchy of King Hussein and then King Abdullah, his son, in Jordan, we see a deterioration in the political situation where there's more marginalization of Islamist groups, more pressure is put on them. The levels of repression vary, but it's generally in that negative direction. So I try to understand, so we have more repression, but Islamists are becoming more moderate at the same time. So obviously correlation is not causation. So I try to look and see, is there a relationship there? Can we kind of draw out certain causal mechanisms? And I try to identify those in the book. So essentially I'm arguing that repression, contrary to, the conventional wisdom, can actually have a moderating effect on Islamist groups. And I call this forced moderation. The flip side of this is what happens to Islamist groups under democratic openings. And in the book, I look at certain forgotten periods of small but significant democratic openings. They were short-lived, but they were meaningful. So looking at the mid-1980s in Egypt and in Jordan from 1989 to 1992. And in Jordan, that was a real democratic experiment. There was a lot of optimism about it. But in looking at those periods of time, I actually find that the Brotherhood did in fact move further to the right. They did not move to the center. And not just the Brotherhood, even if you look at secular parties like the Weft Party in Egypt, they also moved further to the right. So the whole political spectrum was being skewed rightwards, where, it's odd to think that you have an ostensibly secular party like the Weft that are introducing fairly explicit Sharia planks in their political program in 1984 and 1987 in the parliamentary elections, and they're really trying to Islamize their discourse. And why is that the case? Because there was a religious revival that's starting in the 70s, continuing through the 80s and 90s, so they had to be responsive to the popular mood. And that's what democracy at an essential level is at least partly about, is that leaders have to be somewhat responsive to public preferences. So if public preferences go in a particular direction, you can't afford to ignore that. And even you can kind of look at examples like Malaysia to this very day, where again, you have a secular ruling party, supposedly UMNO, but they have Islamized their rhetoric and policies, and there's a kind of religious outbidding between them and the main Islamist opposition party, PAS. So this is the kind of process that we sometimes see where you have an opening of democratic space and you have new parties emerging and they're competing to see who can be more faithful to the cause, who can be more quote unquote religious. And we saw that, I think, during the Arab Spring in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood no longer has a monopoly on the Islamist vote. They have to compete for the first time with ultra-conservative Salafi parties on their right flank. So you have what I call a Tea Party effect, where the far right drags the center right further in that direction. I'm someone who is a big supporter of democracy in the region. I do believe the U.S. should be doing more to prioritize democratic reform in the Middle East, but quite frankly, my argument makes democracy less attractive, at least to American observers. So sometimes when I talk about this, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with my own findings and conclusions, and sometimes I'll say, well, repression under certain conditions can have a moderating effect on Islamist groups, and sometimes people will say, well, are you saying that repression can be good? No, that's not what I'm saying. And actually, I distinguish between different levels of repression. The low to moderate levels of repression we see under Mubarak are simply not comparable to the kind of eradicationist approaches that we see in Egypt today, where the military regime is trying to erase the Brotherhood altogether. Mubarak, as repressive,
which is not going to moderate them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And Mubarak, as repressive as he was, didn't try to destroy the Brotherhood. He did allow them to have a margin of space to operate. So that distinction is important. Not all repression has the same effect.
I agree with you that, in the sense that, Islamists are pragmatists with a program, and they're strategic actors, and they're responding to the incentives and the constraints that they face. And what I think is really nice about your book, and I hope mine as well, is that we sort of bring the politics back into these political discussions, or discussions of democratization and the prospects for democratization in the region. I think you're absolutely right. That in the repressive period of Mubarak, there was an attempt to moderate among Islamist parties within Egypt, if we're talking about Egypt here. Why? Because they wanted to be a player in that political process. Then afterwards, when Mubarak was removed from the scene and there were open elections, the Islamists, or the Brotherhood in particular, saw an opportunity and sort of grabbed for it, which is kind of human nature. When you see a vacuum and a power vacuum, you want to grab for it. And they saw an opportunity to take power, and that was irresistible, and they went for it.
People have to recognize that, yes, Islamists may be a liberal, and they'll continue, in my view, to being a liberal for the foreseeable future. They have been able to evolve. Their relationship to the text and to Islamic doctrine is flexible. So in the 60s, 70s, or even if you look at some of the things they were saying in the 80s, talking about how those who did not believe in the implementation of Sharia law were potentially outside of Islam. They weren't part of the Ummah. So they were making very clear distinctions based on whether you supported their political program when it came to Sharia law. So that kind of brought into question their commitment to political pluralism, for example. But if you look at their political programs from the 1980s, an almost obsessive focus on the role of Sharia in public life. If you look at the Jordanian Islamists from 89 to 1992, they were trying to pass very specific pieces of legislation, whether it was banning alcohol, banning interest, at least some kinds of interest, prohibiting, mandating segregation of the sexes on the primary and secondary school levels. So they were very much oriented in that direction. But I think that since then, they have changed. So I think we have to just recognize that Islamists aren't fundamentally one thing. They may have a general illiberalism, but within that, there is quite a degree of flexibility.